Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Chatham House. I'm Yu Jie. I'm a Senior Research Fellow on China with Asia Pacific Program. Delighted to see many of you in here today, and we're going to be dealing with a relatively easy subject that is on China's choice in this current Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and to what extent that will be impact on China's domestic economic development, and also to a large extent, and how it's going to impact on China's position in the world. Now, as a friend of mine told me that it seems that China has all the cards on the table to be able to play a much greater role as being the international mediator for this war. But however, I consider that by having all the cards on the table is not necessarily a good thing because the choices are too many. And therefore, how to make the right choice that is good for the country and that is good for the world. And that seems to be going to be a very stringent test for the Chinese leadership. Now, today it's not having me to speak in here, but instead having three distinguished experts who has worked on China-Russia relations for quite some time to lecturing and to educate us. So join me today, we have Dr. Zhao Tong from Carnegie Endowment of International Peace and Carnegie Tsinghua Center from Beijing join us. And then we're also delighted to have Dr. Natasha Cook, who is a senior lecturer at World Studies at King's College in London, join us from London. And last but not least, we also have Dr. Marcin Kaczynski, if I pronounce your name correctly, apologize if I did it wrong, and who is also a senior lecturer on China-Russia international relations at the University of Glasgow, join us from Glasgow. So welcome to you all. And before I start, just to declare that even though we're holding an event within Chatham House today, the event it is now on the public record and which will later be available to the public because this is part of the series of war in Ukraine that Chatham House has dealt with in the past few months. And also for any of you who are very much interested in asking questions, and please put your questions in the Q&A function and I will not be looking to the chat box. So if you have any questions, please put it at the Q&A function and I look forward to looking into your questions. Now, given what we have discussed so far, after these nearly 3 months of this war in Ukraine, there has been so much discussed in the West that China's position or China's role as mediator, or to a large extent that China will be affected. And we seem to hear so much about the Western commentators and commenting on China's position, but we hear very little from experts and specialists based in China and taking different views and different voices, and also those voices and views are slightly different from the government position. So we're delighted to have Dr. Zhao Tong here to enlighten us on what you consider are the so-called Chinese perception on this war in Ukraine. So Professor Zhao, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yu, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think personally, in order to understand Chinese position in the Ukraine war, it's really important to recognize the existence of a very serious information gap and perception gap between the Chinese society and the Western societies. Many people in the West are truly surprised by the narratives promoted by Chinese government to Chinese state media, by the fact that Chinese state media is repeating much of the Russian narrative. And Chinese experts also repeat the same talking points. But I want to say that based on my observation, I think China genuinely believes in much of its national narrative. And many Chinese senior officials, experts, they genuinely share the Russian perspectives on many issues, including about the nature of the war, the role played by Western countries, by the United States, and by NATO in this war. Even on many basic factual issues, including whether Russian forces committed crimes in killing civilians, whether the US operated secret biolabs in Ukraine to conduct illegal research on biological weapons. Even on those basic factual issues, Chinese experts, for the major part, genuinely believe in the Russian narratives. I think that's something Western countries need to recognize. It's not just propaganda, it reflects real Chinese belief. For those few Chinese officials, experts who know more, even for them, I think they feel justified for China to promote those alternative facts because they believe that it's the Western countries who are masters in using disinformation to achieve their geopolitical goals. So it's fully justified for China to do that. So this is the Chinese mainstream perception. I think it's important to recognize that, important to convey to China the point that perhaps this is not necessarily in China's own interest. I don't think this has been recognized by China itself, but maybe in dealing with China, it's important to start really driving home that point because that presents a major obstacle for constructive discussion dialogue between the two sides. I understand that there is a lot of interest in knowing how China views the economic impact of the war on China. So even though I'm not an expert on economic issues, I will try to briefly summarize for the rest of my time about Chinese views of the economic impact on China. There is a lot of, I think, concern here in China about, the increasing oil price, gas price, which could lead to overall price growth in downstream industries in China. There is a lot of concern about rising food crisis, which can also lead to downstream price growth. There is concern about secondary sanctions and how they might affect the operation of Chinese banks and other companies. There is also a lot of concern about the long-term economic impact, whether Western countries will reorganize global supply chains, whether they would impose stricter export control policies against China, and make it harder for China to access Western high technologies in the future. But on many of these specific debates, there are still major internal divisions. For example, on the impact on China's energy security and how China should deal with it. Some experts here argue that China should use this opportunity to make good use of cheap Russian oil and gas. But others believe, the biggest lesson China should learn from this war is there is no real friend or enemy, and China shouldn't be overly dependent on any energy exporting country. But ultimately, I think what decides the results of these internal debates is how China's leadership indicates their policy preference. Because if you look at China's overall policy in this war, it's very much a reflection of how Chinese top leadership personally views Chinese interests and Chinese policy. There were initial expert debates about whether China should distance from Russia and side more closely with the rest of the international community in blaming and criticizing Russia. But after the top leadership started to show their interest in prioritizing China-Russia strategic partnership, that internal expert debates started to fade and no longer really matter. And in this highly centralized political system, it's not surprising to see, the increasing internal incoherency between different elements of China's policies. The one last small point I will make is this war reinforces the Chinese concern that China might face similar Western pressure in the future in a China-West confrontation. And to mitigate the impact of future Western sanctions and pressure on China, China needs to be ready. China needs to be more self-sufficient in key economic and technological sectors. But that policy promoted by the top leadership for China to be more self-sufficient is in tension with China's also a very strong interest in preventing economic and technological decoupling from Western countries. But there is no deep and comprehensive thinking, I think, about how to square with these two different policy priorities. But there are other examples, but I don't have time to elaborate. But I think we are going to continue seeing more and more internal coherences in China's foreign policy, including in the foreign and security policy aspects of China's policy towards the Ukraine war. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zhao. I very much agree with you. It seems to be that the economic foreign policy priority doesn't really go hand in hand, and seems to be plenty of contradiction in the Chinese foreign policy these days. Now, there's one question, follow-up question I'd like to ask you. To what extent are you going to interpret the so-called China-Russia cooperation has no limit? It seems to be that phrase of no limit has been widely reported across the Western media. And of course, these are all open for interpretations. And recently, the Chinese ambassador to the United States suggests that even if the cooperation has no limit, but it comes within certain conditions. So how do we interpret this so-called Beijing-Moscow cooperation has no limit?
Well, I think that's exactly the question many Chinese officials and experts are asking themselves, because it looks like the no limit position is very much coming from China's top leadership. And President Xi personally is very committed to the special partnership between the two countries. And he seems to want to stick to this partnership even in the aftermath of the Ukraine war. And because of the increasingly obvious top leadership preference in preserving this unlimited partnership, the officials and experts at the operational level are trying to understand how to really design policies that would be aligned with this top leadership preference, but also be flexible enough to advance Chinese interests overall. So, I don't think China itself has a clear answer. Many of the specific policies, concrete policy issues are being figured out as people, conduct, business deals with Russia and try to evaluate and re-evaluate China's position over time, making small and modest readjustment to ensure the top leadership is happy, and also China gets more positive response from the rest of the international community.
Thank you so much for this very illuminating comments. Natasha, I'm going to come to you next. I mean, in the early conversation, you explained to me there seems to be the contradiction between, on the one hand, that China claimed itself to be the so-called responsible great power, whereas on the other hand, China seems to express very strong reticence regarding the civil society in Ukraine, and also regarding, the sense of the heroic fight of Ukrainian population. So, do you think actually China or Beijing will be managed to square that circle on the one hand, while claiming itself on the international stage being a great power, then on the other hand, showing very strong reticence when it comes to playing a mediating role for this war in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly does seem to be quite a big disconnect, certainly if we're viewing things from London or from Brussels or Washington, between China's, bid to, if you like, be this responsible great power, and I think it's obviously, we're not just talking about being a member of the P5, although of course that does connote a certain responsibility to maintain international peace and security. And apart from the General Assembly, the UN Security Council has been largely absent during this war. So, in a sense, you can argue that this is the kind of, time when China should be stepping up to the plate, if you like. Also, I think, there's a sense in which China, in a kind of narrative sense, I guess, has always presented itself to some extent as aligning with the kind of, the sort of Davids of this world against the Goliaths, you know, so there's a sense in which it could have, if you like, aligned itself with Ukraine, but it hasn't. You know, I think this idea of the kind of studied neutrality approach, if you like, that China's taking, or the other day I was in a webinar with some Chinese scholars who said instead of neutrality, we should use the word independent. I mean, they're kind of fairly similar, but I think China is also wanting to kind of try and suggest that it's not actually neutral, but maybe more impartial. And of course, being impartial isn't necessarily the same as being neutral. But even so, it does look very much as if China has been carping from the sidelines, you know, obviously criticizing very much, you know, Western diplomacy, so-called megaphone diplomacy. It's been doing that for quite some time, and also presenting the war, as the previous speaker said, very much, you know, as a kind of, it does see it very much as a battle between Russia and the West, which is how Russia has been presenting it, as a kind of proxy war between Russia and the West. So this isn't just a war between Russia and Ukraine. And it seems very much that China did underestimate, and well, we possibly ourselves also underestimated, you know, the kind of unity and resolve, both within the EU, but also in a transatlantic sense. And Biden, of course, has really made it his mission to kind of, you know, bring the EU and the US back together, bring Europe and the US back together in a way that, of course, Trump, you know, was trying to do the opposite in many ways. And speaking just to a point, in the questions as well, and the point made by the previous speaker, I think China certainly is very much looking at this, while I wouldn't want to say that Taiwan and Ukraine are the same situation at all. On the other hand, China can't help but be watching, you know, the reaction in the West in particular to this war, and seeing what the kind of policy responses are in terms of sanctions, you know, and the unprecedented nature of these sanctions, you know. So, you know, were China to intervene in Taiwan, make a move on Taiwan, then, you know, what kind of reaction could it expect, if you like, from the West? Although, of course, you know, that would probably be much more about the US. On the other hand, you know, with the Indo-Pacific tilt of so many countries, more recently, including the UK, you know, you can't rule out support, quite strong support from certain European countries as well. Obviously, regarding the EU, China is quite a key factor, actually, in EU-Russian relations. The EU has, of course, criticized China, as has NATO, but Russia remains the main threat there. You know, China is still the kind of label, if you like, attached to China is, you know, strategic competitor, you know, whereas Russia is the malign, revitalized power. You know, Russia is seen as a disruptor. So the EU also has a dilemma as to how to engage with China. You know, China has a dilemma in how to engage with the EU, as the previous speaker mentioned, but the EU also has a dilemma because, you know, the EU in a way still does need to engage with China in a way that it doesn't have to with Russia, of course. You know, China may in the longer term be somehow still important as well for Europe in terms of security, because if China, you know, were Russia to lose this war, then China might, if it's being flexible, it might actually then change its position. So I think we can't rule that out, because it will really all hinge very much, I think, as well on, you know, Russia's performance, which obviously has been, you know, less than impressive so far militarily. I mean, we can't predict what will happen, but, you know, it would have implications, I think, also for Central Asia. We need to think about what would happen in that space, because that's obviously the key part of the BRI. And, you know, hitherto, there's been this kind of rough division of labor in Central Asia between China, you know, providing the kind of economic clout, if you like, and Russia seemingly acting as security provider, and then with the events in Kazakhstan earlier this year, we saw that Russia did indeed step up to the plate when it was called on to do so in a way that China still can't. So I think China is also watching very much to see how this plays out militarily, because Russia impressed China, I think, in Syria, and China is still learning militarily, right? From the West, but also from Russia, and part of their cooperation in defense terms is very much about that. So I think it's a kind of test for China. It's a test for the EU as well. And over time, we might see differences again emerge between countries within the European Union, within the European space. We can't rule that out, but also perceptions may diverge between the US and the EU. So I think there are a lot of obviously questions here. But China, if it maintains this kind of flexible approach, perhaps it may benefit China in the longer run.
Thank you, Natasha. Flexible might sound ideal, but however, my question to you is, do you actually consider China has missed the opportunity to mend its relationship with European Union, given the current relationship is really in stalemate ever since 2021? So do you actually consider, because of China's reticence on this war in Ukraine, has actually make the Europeans felt somehow they have lost the hope for China in this case of playing more proactive and being a mediator?
I'm not sure that we can necessarily say that definitively yet. I mean, I think there are problems, certain kind of countries in Eastern Europe, I think, have those memories of communism and so on. And so for them, China as a communist country is a kind of, is problematic. But I think there are still many ways in which, the EU needs China, and it needs China on things like climate change as well. So, so although normatively speaking, if we start talking about norms and values and so on, obviously, China's approach is kind of unacceptable. But I have a sense that in the longer term, there will be more pragmatic considerations.
Well, let's wait and see whether Beijing will gradually shifting its position. Now, Martin, I'm going to turn to you. As yourself being a long-term observer on China-Russia relations, do you really see much difference between this current, China-Russia, Beijing-Moscow strategic alignment than compare with the China-Soviet Union alliances back to the 1950s? I mean, what's your view?
Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for your opening question. I would start with the observation that the Sino-Soviet, responding to your question, Sino-Soviet relationship was supposed to be also another type of no limits relationship, which was highly asymmetrical, with the Soviet Union having an upper hand. And what I would argue we see today is actually the end of the no limits partnership, because regardless of what Tong discussed about the wish of the Chinese leadership, what we see is that the leadership, even if it is a clear guidance, it does not attempt to force this guidance on Chinese actors. And what we have seen so far is that there is growing normative, political, and ideological convergence between China and Russia. China supports Russia's rhetoric and Russia's justifications for war, but at the same time, what we don't see is help in bypassing sanctions, help in providing an economic relief for Russia. So what I see here is China is the war showing clear limitations to the relationship in the first place. The second element that we see is the asymmetry between China and Russia skyrocketing with the war. So it is not only what we have seen for the last decade or so, the economic asymmetry with China's economy continuing its rise and Russia's struggling to modernize its economy. Now, what is, I think, even more fueling the asymmetry is Russia's military blunder in Ukraine. Because so far, what Natasha mentioned, Crimea, intervention in Syria, they provided Russia with some kind of an equalizer vis-a-vis China. Whereas Russia could not compete with China economically, it could always present its military efficiency as a way of bringing some balance into the relationship. What I would assume Beijing expected in the beginning of the war was a quick victory. What they might have been justified to expect that Russia would succeed in its war against Ukraine very quickly. As it didn't happen, now this last remaining asset of Russia in bringing symmetry to the relationship has turned out to disappear. But what I would argue next is that China, as I understand the Chinese policy, the Chinese leadership is still hesitant which way to go. So firstly, whether to use this opportunity and entrench its position, especially in the Russian political economy. And here I would look at whether China decides at one point to step in and offer financing and investment in key Russian companies, Rosneft, Gazprom, perhaps another financial support for Novatek. It would, at the same time, it would be very risky because it would mean indirectly helping Russia to bypass sanctions. And while there would be price for China in a sense of making Russia even more dependent on China and securing energy supplies from a relatively safe direction, it would still risk not only secondary sanctions, which were mentioned by my predecessors, but by previous speakers, but it would also mean bringing the EU and the US together, which I would assume that it is the outcome that China will do a lot to avoid, not to help European and American leaders to come closer with each other. But at the same time, staying on the sidelines, especially with how the war is going on, brings certain risk of Russia losing the war. And what does it mean to China? How much would it embolden the West and also make the West more willing to contain China in East Asia and especially with regard to Taiwan? So to sum up, I would say that in the short term, regardless of what Beijing does, the relationship with Russia is relatively safe. So either China decides to step in and in a sense turns Russia into its asset in global competition with the US, or the relationship will stay at this level with close political cooperation, but without substantial economic dimension. In the long term, and we can return to this issue in the Q&A session, in the long term, I would see the risk for China related to the domestic political change, which will come one day in Russia. And any new leader, regardless of close to Putin or not, will have the opportunity to reassess the relations with China. So I would stop here.
So if I got it right, is basically you're saying, yes, political cooperation is absolutely fine with Moscow, but however, when it comes to economic cooperation, and then that seems to be Beijing would have ringing more strings and imposing more limits. Is that what you consider? That's what I would see, especially that from the Chinese perspective, it is still the markets of the European Union and the US matter. So I would see the extent to which China is willing to help Russia in the assessment how long-term is the competition with the US. Is there any possibility for China to, in a way, take a break in its competition with the US, or does China need Russia? Surely, I mean, I entirely agree with you. Actually, I was even looking into Russia's capital market, was not even open to the Chinese capital market investment at all, even ever since they have declared the so-called comprehensive strategic partnership. So it does come with some limits. Now, let's go into a fest of really good questions from all of you, audience in here. Now, the first one, may I invite our long-standing Russian expert, Mr. James Nixie, or head of Russia program in here to ask his question to Professor Zhao. James?
Very nice to see you, Martin and Natasha. I know very well. Thank you very much indeed. so I wasn't expecting to talk, but my question was actually for Dr. Tong Zhao, if I may. There was a well-known article by Hu Wei published in the beginning of middle of March, I believe, which argued quite surprisingly that China should set its stall really more along with the United States position and really needed to get away and isolate itself from the Russian position. And considering I don't know, you will know more than me, but he has an official or a semi-official role. This caused a great deal of perplexion. So I was wondering if you had any sense of where that was coming from. Was it sanctioned? Was it not sanctioned? Were there any reverberations as a result of it? Was it significant, or am I overplaying it? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the question. At the early phase of the war, there was indeed a lot of internal debate, especially among the experts, foreign policy, security policy experts. And Hu Wei was a very important example of those experts who believe that this is the Russian invasion is clearly committing a major crime and violating international laws and major international principles, and China should certainly distance from Russia and should use this opportunity to further stabilize China's overall relationship with Western countries, because that's where Chinese strategic interests rest. It's the Western market, Western investments, Western technologies that would secure China's long-term economic development. But I think the reason, according to comments by his colleagues, of Hu Wei. By the way, as you said, Hu Wei is a counselor of China State Council. So he has some semi-official status, and his view is certainly valued within the system. But according to his colleagues' comments, that the reason he chose to wrote a piece and publish it on the social media is because at that time he knew that his view wouldn't be viewed very favorably by Chinese top leadership. And if he wrote an internal policy memo, that memo probably won't reach really high levels and have a major policy impact. So he decided to publish it on social media, and hopefully by gathering public attention and interest and debate and stimulating public debates on this issue, it would indirectly contribute to internal policy debate at high levels and hopefully affect policy debate at that high level. So initially he knew his view was controversial, and soon after, I think the signals that came from China's senior leadership became increasingly clear that China wants to prioritize its strategic partnership with Russia. China is going to criticize the Western countries. So after that became clearer and clearer, I think those internal debates gradually faded. There are still some debates among experts, but those today are mostly around the more specific policy discussions. Recently, there is an important article written by Liu Mengxiong, who is a member of the National Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. He was a member, but he was an important public figure, and he basically published an op-ed on a Singapore newspapers, basically saying, Russian invasion was wrong morally and legally, and China should take the right side of history by standing against Russia. But again, the fact that he decided to publish it on a foreign newspaper again shows that people in the system know that there is a real limit on what they can debate and discuss, and the room for maneuver on specific issues is very limited.
Again, thank you so much for this very illuminating insight. Now, I'm going to turn Marcin and Natasha in here. While we're talking about these two countries, China and Russia, We seem to focusing quite a lot regarding individual leaders. And now I'd like to invite Rodrigo Marura to ask his question. Rodrigo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yijie. So yeah, I would like to understand what's your view on the personal preferences of the two leaders, and how does that affect the current situation, and also how do the current headwinds they faced both militarily and economically affect their personal standings?
This, as has already been mentioned, the guidance on the relationship goes very much from the top. But what I would like to draw our attention to is that what we have seen since the beginning of the pandemic is the limited amount of contacts between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. They talked a couple of times on the phone, on using the video communication. They met once for a couple of hours. So if we take a look, and we haven't heard much about Xi Jinping calling Putin or the other way around since the war started. So in this sense, I'm not sure how much the personal relationship matters at this particular stage. So for sure it matters in the long-term perspective. It matters it has helped a lot to push actors in both Russia and China towards closer cooperation. Also in Russia, it closed down the opportunities for the discourse that would be more skeptical towards this cooperation. But I'm not sure how the situation looks like nowadays, given the really limited amount of contacts between both leaders. And I will just stop here.
I mean, a lot has been made of the kind of personal, almost bromance, if you like, between Xi and Putin. I mean, you could just point to the fact that obviously by comparison with Putin's relationships with other leaders, and perhaps also for Xi, it seems like a very strong relationship. But, I'm not sure that on its own merits, it's necessarily of that great significance. I mean, obviously there were lots of photo opportunities in the past before the pandemic, at the Far Eastern Economic Forum, flipping pancakes together, that type of thing. There are obviously no opportunities like that now. I mean, clearly, for both Russia and China, this kind of individual sort of friendship or closeness could be presented very much as, the two great powers in solidarity together. They're both P5 members, both nuclear powers, and of course also, very much often within the context of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, which now contains India, Pakistan, and of course 4 of the Central Asian countries and so on. So in those kind of forums, if you like, I think it was always very kind of useful to sort of show the two together, to show the way in which normatively they espouse the same kind of ideas, the same kind of, or similar visions, if you like, perhaps for regional order in Central Asia, for example. So yeah, increasingly, I think those opportunities are not coming their way. I think there was another question about, I didn't quite catch the second part of the question about the military headwind, but obviously both Xi and Putin now are kind of seeing Ukraine apparently prevailing over Russia, or at least seeing the way in which Russia, which is a big military power, is to some extent coming adrift, failing in Ukraine. And I think there are going to be certain lessons drawn from that. And Putin is the commander-in-chief. So that will, have maybe some effect as well eventually on Xi's perception of Putin.
So perceptions does matter. Now I'm going to turn atomic bomb in here, because inevitably that the part of the world always try to compare with the current Ukraine situation and vis-a-vis the likely outcome of the Taiwan situation. Now I'd like to invite Michael Harvey to ask his question, if he may.
Hello, I hope you can get my my question.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yep.
Oh, thank you. How closely is China looking at the West's reactions and responses to Russia's invasion and possible conquest of Ukraine in relation to a potential invasion conquest of Taiwan? What lessons are China likely to draw from this? And I would just like to add, we've seen the effects of European sanctions on Russia and the effects on the European economy. What will be the effects on the European economy or the world economy of sanctions against China if China decided to attack Taiwan?
I did actually address that question in my presentation at the beginning, but you may not have joined the meeting yet at that point. But I mean, I would say that China is watching the events pretty closely. And I certainly think that while you can't compare completely Taiwan and Ukraine, obviously China may draw some lessons from this conflict and from the way in which the West has been reacting to Russia, which is the West has shown quite a high level of unity and cohesion that maybe came as a surprise to China as well as to Russia. If anyone else wants to come in on that?
I'll be happy to add a couple of quick observations. I very much agrees with what Natasha already said, but I think Chinese evaluation of the implications for Taiwan strait contingency are still evolving. Initially, China was really shocked by the level of local resistance in Ukraine and their military capacity to fight back, and also the level of Western support, really comprehensive support, military support, and crippling sanctions on Russia, and the likelihood that Russian economy might even collapse, and that could even lead to internal social instability and maybe even regime change in Russia. So that really challenged a lot of China's pre-existing assumptions in a hypothetical military operation against Taiwan, because China, I think, mostly assumed that military operation would be a quick victory. Taiwanese people would basically accept a new reality on the ground. Western countries wouldn't even have time to respond. Even they wanted to respond, the sanctions, the pressure, that isolation wouldn't have time to have real impact on China. And all those assumptions, I think, are being challenged and need to be reconsidered. But I think over time, some of those reflections are being, again, re-evaluated, because as the time drags on, it looks like Russian economy is doing okay. Russian people are generally optimistic about their midterm and long-term economic prospect. And Russia is not necessarily internationally isolated. There are so many fence-sitter countries in the world. So maybe that mitigating impact on Chinese interest in a military operation against Taiwan is decreasing over time. But in general, I would say that Ukraine war makes it even less likely. I think the initial chance for China to deliberately initiating a war against Taiwan in the near-term future is low. But the war makes that even lower as a result. But I will also want to quickly add that Chinese military strategists are clearly learning specific lessons. One lesson, for example, is that China needs probably to launch a major and comprehensive blow to the Taiwanese forces at the very beginning of the war to avoid the Russian mistake of spreading their forces too thin and going into Ukraine in an incremental manner. That means a future military operation could be even uglier than the Ukraine war, and leaves less opportunity for Taiwanese forces and Western forces to react. It also means that the war reinforces the Chinese perception that this is basically anarchic world that we live in. When it comes to geopolitical interests, no one cares about rules and norms and principles. So ultimately, it is material power that matters. So if China wants to achieve its core national interest of unification with Taiwan, it has to depend on its own military power and comprehensive national power. That means China probably will double down on its current policy of comprehensive military modernization, which will probably make the risk of arms race in the region even higher. And the war, I think, encourages the thinking in some Chinese expert community that the example that Russians' decision demonstrated, even though the result is not good, Russian military is not doing well on the battlefield, but many Chinese experts seem to still admire the Russian decision makers' resolve to defend their core national interest against perceived Western hostility. So there may be this growing thinking that for major power like China to eventually rise, to be respected by the rest of the international community, China also has to stand up against perceived Western aggression sooner or later. I think that will also have implication for the Taiwan contingency, and it would make the stakes over defending Taiwan even higher, because Western countries would believe that Taiwan is becoming a frontier for defending Western values, Western norms, Western order. So I think that makes it even more important that we make very rational and careful, prudent policies to avoid unnecessary conflict or inadvertent escalation in this part of the world.
Well, thank you for a very candid comments, Tong. Machin, would you like to add something? No, okay, right, okay, let's go for next question. Now I'm going to ask on behalf of the audience. Hold on, just give me 1 second, let me find it, because they keep jumping back and forth in here. Now it's broadly related to international order question that obviously this question comes from Omema Khan, and he's a nuclear scientist, and he asked, neither China nor Russia sees the current international order as being legitimate. Beijing has again highlighted how China and Russia have committed themselves developing a new model of the so-called international relations. And obviously that so-called new model of international relations have all different kind of interpretations. Now, could I start with Machin this time first? And what is really, in Russia's view, how the international politics should be organized? And equally, this question would go for Natasha and for Zhao Tong as well.
Thank you. Thank you for this question. As we can see from the war in Ukraine, a couple of currents of thoughts that were present in the Russian elites thinking about international politics came together. So firstly, security is on top of any other considerations. Secondly, what Russia wants to achieve is the European order without the US. This is ultimately what it boils down to divide the European and states and the US. And this is something which is probably another big surprise for the Kremlin, that the West reacted quite differently than during the previous crises. But it is also the sphere of influence which is the core of Russia's understanding of international politics. And this sphere of influence can take a number of degrees, with direct control, as we now see, as Russia clearly strives to occupy certain parts of Ukraine, political subordination further in the mid-range, if we may put it so, and a kind of gray zone, especially in terms of security, when it comes to such states as Central European states, or the so-called new members of NATO, so those accepted after 1999. And I think this is something which is at the core of the current Russian leadership and substantial part of elites thinking about international politics, with other non-Western powers exercising similar spheres.
Natasha, Tong, any of you? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think China and Russia seem to, share quite a similar view of world order. I would say Russia certainly, yes, sees itself as a kind of a great power, partly based also on its position in the region as a regional power. In a way, the idea of, regional hegemons, who then translate that power globally as well. And so, obviously you can see that they each have their kind of own regions, if you like. And I think, I think Russia increasingly, operates like a kind of great power. It would probably like a kind of return to the concert of Europe idea. With China, I'm not sure that Russia and China have identical views on what a world order would look like, a different world order would look like. And I think if you look at, they both have this quite civilizational rhetoric now as well, and China increasingly. So, when China talks to the Central Asians within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they very much talk about kind of inter-civilizational dialogue, and they kind of promote themselves as being able to sort of to speak to the Central Asians in a way that Westerners are not able to, partly because they are not emphasizing human rights and so on, and they're not espousing Western liberal norms. And I think Russia perhaps similarly so, but I think that the increasing emphasis, if you like, of both Russia and China on these kind of civilizational identities and approaches means that there is a potential. I mean, I don't want to get into a kind of Huntingtonian kind of, clash of civilizations approach, but I do think that, they don't necessarily, while they may be against a kind of Western liberal order, I'm not sure that it's clear, what they want the alternative world order to look like in normative terms. I think it's much more just about great powers.
I'll be happy to jump in quickly. I think this again reflects the very serious information gap and perception gap between the two sides. Most Chinese officials, experts, general public genuinely believe that this war was a result of Western promoted values, order, and Russia was forced to fight back. It's basically the inherent hegemonism in Western strategic culture and political values that in the long run contributed to the war. And the war is also a result of internal political problems and shortcomings of Western systems, right? It's a result of unchecked interests of Western military industrial complexes. It's a result of Western internal political lobbying. It's a result of Western internal political struggle, political polarization that are contributing to the war. That's the real and genuine Chinese mainstream view. So if we really are serious about reflecting on the war from the Chinese perspective, then this Western dominated power and values, norms, and order needs to change. I think that thinking becomes more popular today in China. But how to change? I don't think China has a real idea. And China is promoting a lot of generic and abstract ideas to build a community of common destiny for human beings. And most recently, Chinese government came up with the Global Security Initiative. A big idea, big initiative, but again, there appears to be lack of substantive content. But I think there is this growing sense here in Beijing that China may need to be more on the offense to push against the Western ideas, values, and norm. The war wouldn't go down by itself if people don't push it. So I would expect a more open confrontation between the two sides. without substantive exchanges of views and proposals. And that is really worrisome. If we can somehow direct the rhetorical confrontation between the two sides into more substantive debates over specific policy disagreements, I think that would be a more constructive way to address the differences and concerns of the two sides.
I think you just averted World War III, Dr. Zhao here. Now, very, very final question, squeeze in, and also this is going to be your last words for all the panelists, and we're now looking into the nuclear option. Now, could I invite Rolly Swart to ask his question? Rolly.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Fantastic. So they're two linked questions. I hope that won't take up too much time. But the first one is if, and potentially is still a big if on some parts of this, Russia was to use chemical, biological, or at the most extreme nuclear weapons in Ukraine, what is your assessment of how China will respond under each scenario? So chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear. And linked to that, to what extent do you think China could play a role in de-escalating Russian activity should Putin move towards some sort of CBRN attack?
I'll be happy to try first. Firstly, I think
very quick, huh?
First, I don't think China shares the same level of concern as Western countries about the risk of Russia resorting to nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. The Chinese experts genuinely think that Russia decision makers are simply using signaling to deter or discourage Western further intervention, perceived Western intervention, including resulting to stronger economic pressure measures against Russia, and also they don't believe Russian decision maker President Putin is irrational or crazy, or being circled, being a corner in a small circle, doesn't have good access to information and making crazy decisions. So China, there is not much discussion on those extreme scenarios. If that happened, I think China would be very worried about the implication for global stability, especially at the regional and international level, and how that would affect China's overall interests. But even in that scenario, I don't think China would go against Russia and criticize Russia, given how China has perceived the nature of this war and everyone's role in it. I just don't see China believing Russia is ultimately responsible, even it took very extreme measures to defend its perceived interests.
Natasha, Martin, final words.
Well, I'd kind of largely agree, really, and I mean, I also personally think that is the way that that Putin behaves. That's the way that Putin, threatens a response. It's the kind of rational madman kind of idea, isn't it? I think it is much more about signaling and trying to deter the West from further support to Ukraine and so on, rather than an actual threat of nuclear war. And he has threatened it before, I think in 2014 as well.
Martin?
If I would just add that if any power were to play a mitigating role, it can only be China in terms of persuading Russia not to go to the extremes. Although I'm also very skeptical about the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons, but I would not go as far as to exclude it.
Well, on that positive note, I really want to say a huge thank you for three of you to have enlightened us on this extremely complex and evolving subject. And surely we will invite you back to the building very soon and try to help us to understand and try to navigate the real complexity on China's position on this war in Ukraine. And also late next month, we'll be in London conference and we're going to dealing with a similar subject on the panel as well. So I look forward to see many of you actually physically in the building and look forward to have further discussions on China, Russia, Ukraine again. So let me please join me to thank Dr. Zhao Tong, Dr. Marcin Kaczynski, and also Dr. Natasha Kirk for all your fantastic contribution here today. And let me wish you a very good evening or very good afternoon. Thank you so much.